Good afternoon to everyone, and I apologize for the reading being so long, but it's one story and it's one unit, and although it's hard to remember all of the details when you're hearing it all at once, it's really important to hear it together. So this afternoon, I want to go straight for the husbands, the 5 husbands and the one who is currently not. Because they have taken up so much headspace for so many interpreters, even though their role is really not very significant. They're used mainly, as I'm sure you know, and without any evidence, to attribute fault and thus shame to the woman who had once been married to them. And yet, if you took out the 3 verses that refer to them, the story would flow so much more seamlessly, instead of having to bump up against them and stall. And most annoying of all, it is Jesus who brings them into the conversation. You want to say, Jesus, this is really not like you, swooping down on people's lives just to be able to say, So I want to go straight for the husbands. They intrude just as Jesus and the Samaritan woman are reaching a moving and critical moment in their conversation. Up to now, it has been about the difference between living, flowing, fresh water from a wellspring and stagnant water from a cistern. It has been about thirst for a larger and more generous life. It has been about freedom from the bondage of a life made bitter by stagnant water. It has been about desire and longing. And then suddenly Jesus swerves. Go, call your husband, he says, and come back. But the woman holds her ground. She will not be put on the back foot, not even by a prophet. And frankly, having had 5 husbands, she is very possibly older than he is. I don't have a husband, she replies. Period. But now, finally, there's a chink of light. Because notice how Jesus responds. You're right, he says. But the word he uses can mean correct, as in you answered correctly. But it can also mean absolutely appropriately, or you answered in a really commendable way, or even you answered beautifully. And then Jesus goes on to reveal that he does in fact know something about her 5 husbands, her difficult life, her courage, and now her way of answering him. You have told the truth, she says simply. He says simply. She has been honest. She has not been defensive or apologetic. She is not rushing to explain. She is not ashamed. And Jesus is impressed. He spends as much time in these verses praising the truthfulness and the stark dignity of her answer, as he does admitting to what he already in fact knows, or at least has heard. Jesus is not interested really in the husbands, but in the kind of person she has become, in the life she has had. Now that leaves us with a really interesting question. If the point of this exchange is not to out the woman's past, but to confirm that Jesus already knows something about her, not just about her rumored 5 husbands, but maybe also about her character, and knows it long before they met at the well. How does that change the way we read the story? Is there anything we missed? Well, the action of this story begins because Jesus has decided to leave Jerusalem and go back to Galilee. If you remember at the very beginning of the story, there have been rumors circulating, rumors troubling to some of the religious leaders about the growing number of disciples gathering around Jesus. So Jesus decides it might be better to let things cool down, at least for now. But Jesus had to go through Samaria. That's what we're told. The word used is strong. It really means imperative. It was imperative that he go through Samaria. Which is odd, because geographically it doesn't entirely make sense. He could certainly go through Samaria. In fact, that would be the shortest route, but there were alternative routes. We also know from the earlier chapters of John's Gospel that this is the second time Jesus has decided to leave Jerusalem for Galilee. In other words, Jesus has probably traveled through Samaria before, taking the same route. And that opens up the possibility that Jesus has to go through Samaria because there is something he needs to do there. And if that's the case, it begins to seem possible that the story of the meeting between the woman of Samaria and Jesus might have been anticipated, even prearranged in some way. Read from this angle, the story gradually suggests why Jesus might have been drawn to meet a Samaritan woman he had only heard about until now. To begin with, she's not unkind when she encounters him for the first time, but she certainly doesn't hold back in questioning him about what he is doing in Sychar at the well and what he wants. "You're a Jew," she says, "a stranger here. What are you doing here, asking me for water?" She's clear that she is a Samaritan woman and he is a Jew. She doesn't deny the rift between them, their cultures, their people. But as the conversation continues, she makes it clear that she also understands how Samaritans and Jews are descended from a common ancestor. She's interested in what unites them, as well as what divides them. And an expectation of the coming of the Messiah is one of the things that unites them. She knows that. And it's at this point in the conversation that Jesus says to her, "Actually, I am he. He hasn't yet said that to anyone. Just at that moment, however, their conversation is interrupted by the return of the disciples, returning from their errand to Lidl. While Jesus' attention is momentarily distracted by them, the woman makes up her mind. She leaves her stagnant water jar at the well and heads back into the city. She isn't sent. She doesn't check in with Jesus first. She just goes. And she has just one thing to tell her friends and neighbors. You need to come and meet this man, she says. Though the word she uses is really not man as in male person, but man as in human person, this fellow human being. He told me everything I did, which could mean simply that he knows all about her personal circumstances, just in case they're wondering. But it could perhaps also suggest that everything he said to her is now making fresh sense of her whole life, giving her life a new meaning. And notice this. The people she meets or seeks out when she gets back to the city also drop what they are doing and leave the city to go out to the well. You don't do that unless you trust the messenger. So much for the notion that the Samaritan woman came to the well at noon, the hottest part of the day, in order to avoid meeting anyone because she was so ashamed. Difficult her life may have been, but her friends and neighbors trust her. Her life has made her ready for this. Back at the well, Jesus is about himself to reap what another has sowed. Because here she comes, accompanied by those whom she has invited to meet Jesus for themselves. She has long ago become a woman with the freedom in herself to do this, and then to let the lives of her neighbors take their own course. They will have to find their own way to live out a contested faith in a word-made flesh Messiah, just as she is now doing. And that is all right. The people who take the church forward, as we know, are not often in the mainstream. And here Jesus seeks out and then puts his trust in a woman estranged from him in language, practice, and theology, whose life is shaped by experiences he cannot fully know, who sends herself out as an apostle, but a woman whose integrity and courage he now knows he has every reason to trust. The Orthodox Church, as I only learned recently, gave a name to this woman from Samaria. They called her Photina, the luminous one. They also call her equal to the apostles, run together in one word. Legends later grew up around her, making her into a compelling preacher. But whatever her name, and however her life played out, she still offers us her courage in embracing her identity as God gave it, and her strength in following her calling as life continued to shape it, asking permission of no one. So under the circumstances, I can probably forgive Jesus for asking about her husband. And to God alone be the glory.